So I wonder how many people actually recognise that track. Well, my next guest has written the first book ever to tackle the dual careers of Marc Bolan and David Bowie as a single story. It is a deep dive exploration into the birth of London's pop music and youth culture, from skiffle to psychedelia and the beginnings of glam rock. This book includes interviews with friends and family of both superstars, some of whom have never spoken on record before. The author, as I said, is an award-winning biographer and a very much respected critic and musician. He is Marc Burrows, and I'm so pleased to say he joins me on The Late Show. Hello, Marc.
Hi.
First of all, can I just ask, you didn't flinch, but I have listeners, when I say David Bowie, all say, can you please get the name right? So then I'll say Bowie for a few weeks and then I'll go back to Bowie. What is it? If anyone knows, you will.
It's Bowie, but Bowie didn't care.
He didn't care. Good, thank you. The track I played there was The Prettiest Star, unknown session with David Bowie.
Yes.
So tell me, and you requested we play that. I've never ever heard that before, actually, that track.
So that track is the follow-up to Space Oddity. So Space Oddity, huge hit, 1969, moon landings, sold over 100,000 copies. Bowie thinks, brilliant, I've made it, this is amazing. That was his next song, lovely, beautiful song, absolutely just crashed and burned. No one bought it, wasn't really heard. The reason it's significant is that's Marc Bolan playing guitar. That beautiful guitar line, which is absolutely gorgeous, is Marc Bolan, and that was one. It's pretty much the only. There's only a handful of times when they're recording together, and because Marc Bolan at that point was just getting into playing the electric guitar, he was months away from writing Ride a White Swan. So they, Bowie, Tony Visconti was producing both of them. That's Tony Visconti playing bass on that song, and he suggested that Bolan came in, played that guitar part. They had a bust up at the session, and it was kind of the beginning of a sort of sour period of their relationship. It apparently was very chilly at the end of it, but it's a gorgeous piece.
So I'm fascinated. So forgive me. You know, I'm about the only person in this building, because Tony Blackburn's not here, who remembers the 60s. And I was a huge fan of both. But I had no idea of their relationship, truly, until I was reading about your book. And because I have only just got a copy, I was reading all the reviews, which are by the fans of both Bolan and Bowie. So these would be your harshest critics. They all, I don't know if you bothered to look at them, five-star reviews throughout. And by reading the reviews, it could flesh out the book for me, their comments and what they were saying. And one of them said, well, we all know their relationship in the 70s, but what about this book shows us their relationship in the 60s. I didn't know their relationship at all, Marc. I had no idea. But they both had the same manager, is that right? They
briefly both had the same manager. When they first met in 1965, they briefly had the same manager, a guy called Les Conn, who used to say con by name, con by nature. He was a proper North London, like Stoke Newington lad who basically was a hustler and not particularly effective, but he was briefly managing both of them. They met. We think they met. There could have been other times they met before, but we think they both met when they were both employed by Les Conn to paint his office.
That's hysterical.
They both needed a couple of bob. They were both between record labels. They were both, well, Bolan hadn't even had a single out yet. Bowie had just been dropped and was recording something else. None of them were even called David Bowie and Marc Bolan yet.
Yeah. And is it true you're called Marc after Bolan?
Yes. Yeah,
so your parents were huge fans?
Yeah, they were. In fact, I went to see my dad last weekend, and he told me that he'd begged my mum to let him use Bolan as my middle name, and she put her foot down. But
Marc is spelled in exactly the same way with a C. So they did. I think both of them changed their names a couple of times, didn't they?
Yeah, they did. Bowie had a few different ones. I mean, mostly there were versions. He was called Dave J at one point, Davy Jones, because his real name was Davy Jones. Davy Jones with a Y, Davy Jones with an IE. Like lots of different versions. Bolan was briefly called Toby Tyler. When he was trying to be a kind of Bob Dylan, Donovan style folk troubadour. The really fascinating thing is they changed their name to definitively, for now and forever, David Bowie and Marc Bolan, officially within a week of each other.
But they were with, well, Bowie was with so many bands, wasn't he? He was, in his career, before he became a solo artist, he was with far more bands than Bolan, I would have thought.
Yeah, completely.
Like the Riot Squad.
Yeah, completely. Well, Riot Squad's a really interesting one because the Riot Squad is one that people didn't even know about until when the demos surfaced a few years ago. That was during a period where he wasn't actually being in bands. He was being a solo artist. He was making his kind of anti-newly Cockney chimney sweep, knock it on the head, apples and pears first solo album.
Yeah, can I just come in there? Because he was actually quite middle class, wasn't he? This was almost a professional Cockney accent.
Yeah, and it's the main difference between them is that Bolan was very working class. Bolan is North London, Stoke Newington, Jewish family, very working class. Dad was a lorry driver, mum worked down the market. Bowie was much more middle class, like suburbia, Bromley. His dad worked for a charity. His mum, I think, mostly was a stay-at-home mum. So it's they had very different lives. But yeah, Bowie. That's why Bowie has this much more kind of bigger musical education. He was exposed to jazz and Kerouac and things like that. Whereas Bolan, it was what's on the radio. It's 7 inches and stuff.
Yeah, and can we talk? I mean, both of them, which is why, in all honesty, I was so intrigued by their relationship, because they're both, in my mind, peacocks. I mean, Bowie, I'm not the first to say this, was a work of art. He was, the way he would reinvent himself and use his self and his body. I mean, I heard someone say that he, this big announcement, I'm bisexual, wasn't actually true. It was just something he thought, I'll do that and that will be the next stage. I don't know whether you discussed that in the book. In fact, one of the reviews said, there is, I don't know if I've got this right, there is an opinion that they could have been lovers. Is that true?
Well, possibly, but there's no documentation of that. But it's very clear that basically everyone was sleeping with everyone.
Yes.
And there wasn't a great deal of discretion between them. So it's very possible. I don't know if they did. I mean, they were going to a lot of those kinds of parties.
But they were both, I would imagine, extremely vain.
Incredibly vain, yeah. And they were both mods. That's one of the things. Because this is the thing. Their entire lives echo each other, even though before they knew each other, born the same year. They both were the earliest versions of mods. And when they're not the kind of wearing a Target kind of like Brighton Beach kind of mods. They were like smart suits, nice ties, decent haircuts, kind of influenced by like Jack Kennedy and people like that. They both individually came to that. They were incredibly vain, both of them. When they met, Bowie said that they talked about shoes and shirts.
And do you think they were incredibly competitive?
Yes, massively competitive.
All the way through? All the way through.
It's an interesting thing about their personalities, because not so much in the early days, because a lot of that time, Bolan was ahead. A lot of the 60s, Bolan's ahead, and the 70s. And
did you say, forgive me, did you say John Peel helped his career?
Oh, yeah. Well, John Peel was a huge Marc Bolan fan. John Peel basically lifted Tyrannosaurus Rex, the early version of T-Rex. He took them on tour with him. Whenever he went out and did DJ gigs, he'd insist that they put Tyrannosaurus Rex on. He once got Melody Maker or NME, one of them, gave him an award, a cheeky award once, for services to Tyrannosaurus Rex because he was so obsessed with that band. So, and they kind of fed into each other, because he booked them for one of his first ever Radio 1 sessions. And then when the BBC heard them, they were like, this is far too weird. We don't like. Well, mate, you can have it on your weird show, but we're not. But we're kind of annoyed at you for bringing this in. And they instructed Peel's producer to sack him and not ask. He's not presenting this anymore for bringing this weird band.
Because of bringing Bolan in.
But what actually happened is the producer, whose name I've completely forgotten, but loads of radio nerds are shouting at me now about it. They decided, while he still had the power, before he was sacked, he booked Peel for the next 12 weeks while he still could. And what happened is the audience fell in love with John Peel, meaning the BBC couldn't sack him.
Yeah.
So
those were the days.
So that it was a lot safer then. But it was this totally kind of self-supporting relationship. You've got, on the one hand, Peel brings Tyrannosaurus Rex out and makes them huge, basically exposes them to all the hippies, but it's because of them being weird on Radio 1 that Peel was forced to do the show for 12 weeks, and everyone fell in love with him and thus had the career that he had. So
they both benefited from that relationship, Peel and Bolan. And then did Bolan, so I didn't know this either till I read about your book, he had a television programme called Marc TV.
It's just called Marc.
Just called Marc?
Yeah, it's 77. It was pretty much the last thing he ever did.
Why did I never see that? 1977.
Yeah, it was. I mean, if you watch it, it's all on YouTube. It's ropey. What's exciting about it? Because this is the other end of Bolan's career. Because as you know, Bolan is the biggest star in the world, in the country, for a couple of years. This massive run of incredible glam rock singles, and then he kind of fades away because he does the opposite to Bowie. Bowie reinvents himself, becomes a different kind of artist, tries new things. Bolan decides to give the fans what they want, and then the fans, of course, get bored.
Yeah.
So they both have these wilderness years where they're both doing a lot of drugs, and one gets very thin and one gets a little bit overweight, and one gets very successful and one doesn't. And then they come back together in 77, and they're both cleaned up, they're both healthier, they both look better, and Mark's trying to relaunch his career, and he's become this kind of godfather of punk, because the punks loved him. He was the only one of the old guard that the punks loved. The Damned supported him on his last tour. So he did this show for ITV called Mark, went out 4:30 in the afternoon.
No.
And he'd have he'd have the Bay City Rollers on, and he had like a kind of Legs and Co style dance troupe on, and it was all very cheesy and very camp. But he had different he'd always have like the Jam played it, the Boomtown Rats played it. Like the very last one had Generation X on it when
4:30 in the afternoon.
Yeah.
This is hysterical.
Bolan introduces Generation X by saying they say that this next band's lead singer is as pretty as me. So we'll see. It's Billy Idol, of course. But
Yes.
and that episode ends in confusion, and Generation X stole the drum kit and ran away.
Oh, those were the days.
Yeah,
Oh, God.
and we're banned from Granada TV for the next 10 years.
So it was Granada.
Yeah.
So shot up there. So you say, they both sort of cleaned their act up, and they both ran again parallel for some time.
So their parallel career kind of, by the end of the 70s, things are very different. The beginning of the 70s, you've got 1969, 1970, they're both kind of level pegging. It's 1-1. You've got Bowie has just had Space Odyssey, huge hit, 100,000 sales, one of the biggest singles of the year, one of the best songs of all time. But the next one flops, and everything before it flops, and the album flops. Like the single does 150,000 sales. The album that it's taken from does 7,000 sales. But at the same time, Bolan is in Tyrannosaurus Rex before they became T-Rex, and they've got this cult following. All of his albums sell 20,000. So it's kind of 1-1. One's had this huge hit, but just this one hit, and the other one has got this kind of more consistent career, but it's never going that high. But then you get into the 70s, Bolan writes Ride a White Swan, puts glitter on his cheeks, like shortens the name of his band, and the rest is history.
Yeah.
And Bowie plays catch up for a few years. And really, when you see Bowie, the early Ziggy Stardust stuff, Starman is very much him doing T-Rex.
Gosh, I never thought about that.
But then,
Oh my gosh, yeah.
If you look at the singles from that period, from 70 to 74, if you just look at each of their singles in a row, it's amazing. It kind of goes, it goes Ride a White Swan, Life on Mars, Get It On, Pretty. Oh You Pretty Things, John I'm Only Dancing, Jeepster, Ziggy Stardust. Every single song is a 20th Century Boy. Every single song is a masterpiece. But then they dry up for Bolan, and Bowie becomes different. Now, the end of the 70s is a different thing altogether. My book starts at the end of the 70s, and then it rewinds to 1947 when they're both born. The end of the 70s, Bowie has won. Bowie is by far the biggest star, by far the most important. He's making his Berlin records. He's just put out Low. He's about to release Heroes. And Bolan's on his uppers. So he gets this chance to do this TV show. And on the very last episode of the TV show, the very last one, he brings on David Bowie as a guest. And Bowie does the world's first ever performance of Heroes on that show. And it's everyone who was there says it's incredible. It's this incredible piece of TV. And then afterwards, they do a duet, and it's the only time they ever filmed.
And was this show live?
No, it was pre-recorded, and this is the interesting thing. So this is September 1977. They film the show. They do this duet at the end of a jam they're both writing, but they only get 30 seconds or so into it before Marc Bolan falls off the front of the stage because he's quite drunk by this point, and it's a complete farce. And if you read the book, the whole story's in there. Bolan falls off the stage, and then the power gets cut because the unions have hit 7 o'clock and they won't work anymore. So they have to cut it. So it finishes. It does it. Eddie and the Hot Rods, who are also on the show, haven't even
come on.
They haven't even filmed their bit. They have to come back another day. Now, what the really sad thing that happens is Marc Bolan dies before the show airs. Bolan dies in that horrible car crash the week later. And I mean, Bolan is already dead when Eddie and the Hot Rods come back on to record their bit for the show. So by the time the show goes out, this last final reunion of these people that met in 1965 and had this friendship and rivalry that had gone from 65 all the way to 77. It ends there in this really, really tragic way.
And that was his last television appearance.
Yeah, and his last live performance.
His last live
performance was with David Bowie.
Oh my gosh, I mean, that's your whole storyline. It was made for you, wasn't it? Unbelievable. I have a copy of this book, which Mel will tell you, this will be the first book I've read for many months. I've got really bad at reading. I cannot wait, and it's got pictures in as well. Yes. Has had amazing reviews. It's called The London Boys, David Bowie, Marc Bolan, and the 60s Teenage Dream. And we've been speaking to Marc with a C, Marc Burrows, the author. Thank you, Marc.
Thank you very much.